Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 47. Giving Ideas Shape, Crystallizing Inventiveness, on charting a new course, from storing secret sauce to steering soaring success. The last 4 episodes released have served as a mini-series, or a tetralogy, deviating chronologically to lay the foundation for some important aspects of earlier innovation, still of relevance to us. Let's now come back to the current point in our story, the 1400s.
But let's first check out what our fictional friends have been up to lately.
Steve, Brian, Brenda, and Irene are sat down for a serious chat. Irene's Aunt Gertrude has bequeathed some very fancy antique furniture, and Irene is in a slight panic. The others are like, "What's the matter, Irene? You should be celebrating." She's like, "Of course I'm thrilled, but the problem is our cat Iris keeps scratching furniture all the time. That's okay for the cheap stuff we have now, but won't do for this new furniture." Brenda is like, "Hold on, I was at a pet show the other day, and many cat owners were complaining about the same thing." So they decide to smash heads together and build a solution. They still have a week to go before the furniture is delivered. And after some much brainstorming, experimenting, and reiterating, lo and behold, they've invented Distract-A-Cat. Not to be confused with that Monty Python sketch we've mentioned before. So now that their latest clinical trials have passed, they're sat there again, looking at their invention quite pleased. Steve's like, "Folks, we did it. This is genius, our two-pronged solution. Firstly, our rosemary-based solution, liquid type, is sprayed onto the furniture. While we humans tend to like the fragrance of the herb, we've demonstrated, after so much trial and error, that cats hate this herb." Irene chips in, yes, and the dummy cat furniture that serves as Iris's scratching post is brilliant too. Again, after much experimentation, we demonstrated that smearing lavender on it really has the cat attracted to the post. Brenda then goes, "You know what? We should commercialize this. The next pet show is only a few weeks away. We can make a few prototypes to demo at the inauguration." They're all thrilled. High fives, etc. And then Brian is like, "Wait a minute. There's a big problem here. Remember last year, we built this similarly ingenious solution to stop our dog Bruno from making an almighty mess while drinking his water. That really cool bowl we built." Brenda adding, "Yeah, and it was also genius that you branded it the Super Bowl to commercialize it." Yes, Brenda, but don't you recall that slimy guy from down the street simply replicated our device and made tons of money given his contacts, and we were, well, just bowled over. We got nothing. So how the hell do we safely commercialize our new Distract-A-Cat and not run into the same issue again?
To make or not to make?
I guess it's safe to say that many of us, such as those interested in reading these pieces about innovation, have had some interesting ideas and perhaps even built such solutions at some point. But here we see the problem, what's called the inventor's dilemma. As soon as you take it to market, other actors might invariably reverse engineer it and flood the market with copycat. Sorry, Iris, it's not you. Versions of the same thing. This is a problem that's plagued inventors for centuries. From the very beginnings of proper innovation, one might say, you've worked hard, put in a lot of your own money, certainly time and risk, to build something new, something innovative, that elegantly solved an existing problem. It's your baby, but how distressing is it to then, when you take it to market, helplessly watch others free ride on your sweat and toil, and end up making an easy buck, much more than you ever did. And it's not just after you take it to market. It could be people you hire for the manufacture, who inevitably steal your manufacturing secrets and soon set up shop elsewhere on their own. Sure, you could do all the manufacturing yourself, just your immediate family perhaps, but then you're limiting the potential here. You cannot scale this beyond the limited hands available. You cannot bring in potential investors to fund you to scale for a future return, as they might themselves steal your idea and process once you've told them why and how this is a great and working solution. But this problem wasn't definitively solved until March 19, 1474.
The arsenal of innovation.
But before we get to how exactly that came about, let's make a trip to one of the most romantic tourist destinations that can ever be, Venice. I'm sure you'll agree, even the very thought of being on one of those gondolas, serenely floating past, ducking bridges, amid buildings that seem to actually float on the water. Even as you enjoy your gelato in hand, the striped-shirted gondolier suddenly breaking out into a passionate song in baritone in his vowel-filled mellifluous language to the lilt of an accordion. Enticing, no? Back in the 1400s, the Republic of Venice was one of the city-states on the Italian peninsula, locked in, as we saw in Episode 43, Episode 44, and Episode 45, in tense competition and rivalry with the other city-states and beyond. Of these, Venice, being, shall we say, waterborne, had extensive maritime interests, being the main conduit for the overland spice trade with the Orient. The main source of the spices were India, but the Arabs, being in the Middle East, were the monopoly and the middlemen selling them with a massive margin. Other city-states such as Genoa and Pisa were specifically also maritime rivals. It's in this milieu that aforementioned Venetian statute came to be passed to be the Venetian state, symbolizing the patent system as we know it. And this is essentially how it solved the inventor's dilemma. The inventor submits an application to the state, fully disclosing all the details of the invention, in exchange for a full monopoly on its use for a said period of time, in this case, 10 years. Only after that period would others be able to also use the said invention. This specific act in itself can be argued to be the culmination or codification of an ongoing trend, but to see why 1474 was a decisive leap forward, let's look at recent precedents.
A Venetian blinder.
Previously, any such monopolies granted were ad hoc. For example, Brunelleschi, who met as the first modern engineer in episode 45, using his reputation, obtained a monopoly from Florence on his barge he built with great ingenuity and at his own expense to transport marble to the site of the dome. But as the barge tragically capsized in its very maiden voyage, leading to huge personal losses for Brunelleschi. The event remained a one-off rather than become standard procedure. Even within Venice, they got it wrong initially. In order to protect their competitive edge in the making of the famous Murano glass, the Venetian state initially put its makers on an island they couldn't leave lest they leak the secrets to others. Effectively, a gilded cage. And did you say glass ceiling? But by the time we get to the stated date, it was clear they had to do better. Let me summarize all the main features of the system before we evaluate its impact, not just in those times, but right into our own. Register with the government agency, sort of standard form-filling application procedure. The novelty requirement, it must be genuinely a new invention. There shouldn't be comparable, in modern-day terminology, prior art. The functional requirement, it must be working, not just a fancy idea. Specifics in footnotes.
On what grounds?
I guess we still haven't fully answered the question. Why Venice? While all that story about going on the gondola is charming, think about this. Venice is not even built on proper land. It shouldn't even exist in the first place. Venice came about as a result of some very ingenious innovations in engineering, including advanced canal work, water dredging, and similar. I mean, how many other places do we know of like Venice? As a corollary, it also meant that the Republic of Venice had no agricultural hinterland to fall back on, the typical situation with most urban centers, meaning they had to look elsewhere. They had to innovate in a way their neighbors didn't have to. And that's what led to the rise of Venice as a supreme economic power over the centuries around the current period in our story. But as I've hinted, what happened in Venice didn't stay in Venice. They couldn't patent the patent system itself.
Patent pending. Patiently. End.
In the vast sweep of the story of innovation from the earliest times of civilization, the idea of systematic, legally codified protection of innovation, or more broadly, intellectual property, took a long time to crystallize, as it did in Venice in 1474. Maybe the Murano glassmaking helped? Among the ancient peoples, as I've chronicled in previous episodes, try episode 38 for example, we see great many feats of engineering and more broadly innovation. But such a system as we just saw never really took shape. The Romans, for example, had very little conception of the quantifiable commercial value of an author's output. An author was paid for the scroll or parchment on which the work was written, rather than for the intellectual work itself. So yes, the idea that inventions could be protected by legislation, giving the inventor a limited-term monopoly as compensation, while later released into the public domain, itself was a huge inventive leap. And as we saw in episode 43 on the bottega system, the medieval system was the guilds, who as a protectionist cartel catering to the existing producers, had absolutely no incentive to encourage innovation. And just as in that episode, even in this case, it was a tough fight to break such existing forces of tradition and stasis. But with the Venetian patent statute paving the way to liberate an inventor from the inventor's dilemma, the path was paved for a huge unleashing of creativity. What started in Venice, it can be said, reached a decisive milestone or matured in England, but that was a couple of centuries later. So I'll come back to it in due course. But some of the overall dilemma still remains. What is the correct time limit for the monopoly rights granted to the inventor? 10 years? 14? How do we exactly assess the value of an invention to decide this? Because the counterpoint is, too long a monopoly stifles further innovation. Because, as we've seen time and again in this series, all new progress is built on the old. Which then, projected to the current day of much more rapid technological progress, only intensifies the question, is the monopoly time in years, decades, too long a period if we are to keep pace with our current expectations of much faster innovation than was conceivable 550 years ago? Still, I trust we can see that this invention of inventions was one of the most consequential innovations of all time.